Okay, so good evening. It's my privilege to introduce the second of our two lectures to be given today by Professor Terry Eagleton. From 2008 until last summer, it was my still greater privilege to have him as a distinguished professorial colleague in the Department of English Literature and Creative Writing at Lancaster. Previously, Terry was John Edward Taylor Professor of Cultural Theory at the University of Manchester and Thomas Wharton Professor of English Literature at the University of Oxford. During his 13 Lancaster years, Terry has given scores of tutorials to postgraduates and undergraduates and lectured on a host of topics, including terror and tragedy, Christ and communism, and Luther and Lenin. In so doing, Terry has indelibly written himself into the history of both of not only the department, but also alliteration. Thank you, Joe. Thank you. It's terrible experience, Terry. It makes perfect sense, therefore, that his chosen topic tonight should be heaven and hell. This afternoon, Terry took us to heaven. This evening, in his own words, he is going to give us hell. Friends, students, colleagues, Professor Terry Eagleton.
Yes, the audience for heaven was, I think, somewhat smaller than this, given the darkness of the human heart, and given the fact that the devil, as they say, has all the best tunes. But why does the devil have all the best tunes? I mean, Milton the God famously sounds like a kind of constipated civil servant, whereas it's Satan shimmers with mutinous life. Nobody would have an orange juice with a twist if they could have a whiskey with bacon. So why is evil so sexy and good so unglamorous? And why does virtue seem so boring? I mean, the very word has a kind of quaint Victorian ring to it, sort of virtue. Why is it that some years ago, when I told my then 13 or 12-year-old son that I was writing a book on evil, he said, "Wicked." Thus unwittingly improving the point I was making. So, well, I think one answer to this is historical. It's just with virtue which is boring. It's a particular historical conception. Think of Aristotle's so-called man of virtue, who lives more fully and richly than the vicious, the wicked. Think also of Jesus. I was talking this afternoon about Jesus' words about abundance of life. I come that you should have life and have it more abundantly, a kind of superabundance of life. That, I think, is what virtue, ancient virtue, Aristotelian virtue is about. For Aristotle, virtue is something you have to get good at by practicing it, like playing the trombone, tolerating balls at sheriff parties. Being a virtuous human being, for this conception, profoundly different from modern conceptions, is a set of practices, and those, not a set of sentiments. I'll say more about that later. And those who are really brilliant at being human, what Christians call the saints, are the virtuosi of the moral sphere. They're the Pavarottis and the Madonnas of virtue, so to speak. Herbert McCabe, my great friend and now late Herbert McCabe, theologian, said that Jesus Christ died of being human. He died of having no defenses. Yes, he died simply of giving his humanity, which of course is politically, as we know, profoundly dangerous. So goodness in this Aristotelian view, this rather unfashionable view, there of course there is an important strain of so-called virtue ethics, within moral philosophy. Virtue is a kind of prospering in the affair of being human. A prospering which, if Sigmund Freud is to be believed, none of us manages particularly well. We don't do very well. But the wicked, whatever you want to call them, are those who haven't really developed the knack of living. Those who botch the business, like you might botch cooking an omelette or thinking symphony. They're inept and crippled and deficient people who never really get the hang of human existence. They're like poor artists who can't knock themselves into shape. I should add, incidentally, that people, fortunately, people like this make up a minuscule proportion of the world's population, even tinier than supporters of Jeremy Corbyn at Knightsbridge. Evil on this theory of evil, which is a very traditional one, has real effects, but it's not really real in itself. It's a lack, deficiency, and inability to be truly alive, an incapacity to thrive. It may look seductive and flamboyant, sexy, as they say, but this is just a flashy show it puts on to cover up the hollowness at its heart. Whereas the virtuous are those who, like good artists, can realize their powers and energies and capacities to the full. Virtue is a kind of energy or exuberance, which is why it's thought to have something to do with God, not because God is a moral being, as I was arguing earlier on. Previous lecture, God isn't a being at all, and shouldn't really be talked about as existing in the way that chairs and tables and microphones exist. And he's not a moral being. I think most theologians would agree that God's not moral. To say that he's good is not, well, first of all, as Aquinas would argue, when we say things like, when we predicate such qualities of God, that he's good and compassionate and just, as Aquinas would say, we don't know what we're talking about. So, these are, as Aquinas would say, analogous terms, laborious stretching of language to encompass that which we, as Aquinas would say, we just don't know what we're talking about, though of that of which we must remain silent. It's always possible to say a few words, and those few poor, helpless words are known as theology. So to say that God is good is not to say that he's remarkably well behaved, eats his greens, but rather that he's an infinite abyss of self-delighting life, a sublime superabundance of life, as I was saying. Again, for those of you who tragically missed my earlier lecture, heaven is just a kind of blast, a riot, a rave, a perpetual and delirious being in love, and utter security of knowing that you are loved unconditionally. All of which, as I say this afternoon, is also slightly alarming. Slightly alarming. Yes, we're not built for stability. We're too mediocre. But that's so whatever happened then to this ancient notion of goodness as something attractive, infinite, and exuberant, and exciting, and evil as boring, and banal, and void, and vacant, and deficient? Well, I mean, why do we now see the thing the other way around? Why is everybody talking about Gothic, for instance? Well, I think it's to do, I'm afraid to say, to use an old Marxist cliche, that I've now been using almost 80 years, so I can't use it. Well, I'm using this one for what? So that was very precocious. I wasn't even. It's to do, I think, with that famous rise of the middle classes. You open a history textbook, history of the world at any point randomly, what does it say? It was essentially an age of transition. And the middle classes went on. That's why God put the middle classes on earth. A bit like the bread or the sun keeps rising. As they extended their clammy grip on Western civilization and Western morality, there was a gradual redefinition of virtue. Virtue now came to mean not energy or exuberance, but, as we know, thrift, prudence, chastity, meekness, temperance, industriousness, all the things that drove Friedrich Nietzsche wild after I mean, so no wonder people prefer vampires. It's definitely what virtue actually means. Virtue has now become, in fact, essentially negative. Not only boring, not only tedious, but really negative. It had lost its sexiness. We were now moving towards that great perversion of moral thought, which we identify above all with the greatest of modern philosophers, Immanuel Kant, for which virtue is about duty, responsibility, obligation, the law, and so on, rather than being, in a more traditional and orthodox way, in the first place, about how to enjoy ourselves. We need, because how to enjoy ourselves, because we're so opaque to ourselves, I mean, an insight of modernity that we are desperately opaque to ourselves and often much more transparent to others. We need a special kind of language to tell us what will count as virtue. You know, as I was saying earlier today, in Christianity, that's not a set of doctrines or propositions, it's a narrative. What counts as thriving is the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Actually, stories. Yeah. But to go back to the point about Kant, ethics is essentially a question of how to be happy, how to enjoy ourselves. As I said earlier on, again, I'm sorry to keep referring back to the happy, the very word happiness is a kind of feeble ring to it, you know. It evokes images of red plastic noses and of a 90-year-old Cliff Richard cavorting around in a striped blazer and so on. And even the better term, Aristotle's own term, eudaimonia, despite sounding like a lung disease, which really means well-being. It's better, much better idea, well-being, but that's now been hijacked by the feel-good industry and all that stuff. It's not, of course, the duties and responsibilities and laws and obligations are now cast aside any more than St. Paul thinks that the law is simply cast aside. Doesn't just say there's no salvation in it in itself. The law won't save you. Okay, so they're just cast aside in some kind of naive libertarianism, but that they have their place only insofar as they contribute to the fullest flourishing of human life, which we know as virtue. Some other words, perhaps. We have a duty, an obligation to avoid murdering other people, because people who are murdered find it very hard to flourish and enjoy it. So my forensic colleagues, that's what you're supposed to laugh at. The fame, my real thing. But as I say, what counts as virtue is not apparent. We can't just look inside ourselves and see the answer is really amazing. Instead, we need special kinds of language like moral philosophy and so on to help us in these matters, and political theory, which is also, I mean, for Aristotle, the line between ethics and politics is extremely narrow. And so we have an endless conversation, call it ethics, about what it is to live well, which has never reached an end, a conclusion, an agreement, and probably never will. We all agree that it's a bad idea to sell children into slavery, unless there are a few child slayers somewhere, in which case, forgive me. But we can't agree why we agree on that. We don't know. We can't find that consensus. We have a consensus, more or less, but we can't. The question is how we found it. And that, among other things, is known as liberal society, where we agree to disagree, astonishingly, on some of the most fundamental questions. You think maybe we'd agree to disagree on some of the superficial matters, but we'd agree on the basic ones. We don't agree on fundamental questions, and probably never will. That's part of liberal modernity, it probably doesn't matter that much as long as we avoid selling children into slavery, at least selling my own children into slavery. Even to say, well, as Christians, I suppose, would say the image of how to live well is the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. That, of course, needs interpreting, and there is an endless conversation and conflict over what that means, known as theology. So that doesn't come to an end either. People, particularly young, I don't like the phrase young people, but anyway, students and so on, these days have become interested in the so-called undead, zombies, vampires, and so on, who exist in some twilight, indeterminate realm between life and death. And I think that traditionally the name for that has been, or one name has been evil. The people who can only manage a sort of sham and inauthentic form of life, a kind of ghastly parody of genuine living. People who look alive, actually in some sense are dead. The damned are monstrous, Dracula-like travesties of the living. Take, for example, the case of Jimmy Savile. Savile may or may not have been evil, I don't know. But he was certainly a hole on the air. I mean, the point of his wig, shades, bling, cigar, tracksuit, spring dress, and so on, was, of course, to conceal the fact that there was nobody behind him. His eyes were dead, and his geniality was entirely bogus. He was devoid of talent, and had no relationships with other human beings. His idea of a relationship was sexual assault. So, for whatever reason, Savile wasn't a real person, a fact of which, being highly intelligent, he seemed to be quite aware. Well, perhaps something like that is what it means to be in hell, though the phrase in hell, as I was saying earlier about the phrase in heaven, grammatically, eluctably, it reminds us of in Blackpool. Whether that's heaven or hell, I will not find the job. But there can't, of course, in any literal sense, be a place called hell that there are people in, because there can't be any life outside God. Nobody could live outside God. Any more than you can have an actual location called hope, despair, or love. I'm in love. It's not to be mistaken for I'm in Leeds. Despite mathematical similarity, as Wittgenstein says, we're all the time thrown by our language. Our language keeps throwing up fictions and illusions and fetishes. By the very nature of its grammar, we have to keep demystifying it, like the idea that God is a super person, or a thing, or an entity, or a being. Yes. So hell means not, I think, perpetual punishment. It means annihilation. I mean, even the Pope now acknowledges that. Popes haven't been the most brilliant theologians, to say the least. The fire of hell is God himself. Fire of hell is God with his terrible, relentless, uncompromising, unconditional love, which shrivels to bits those who can't take it for whatever reason. God is a terrorist of love. There's nothing lovely about love for the Christian gospel. I mean, St. John never stops talking about love, and no document is less lovely. The ending of William Golding's novel Pincher Martin, I won't give away the surprise ending there, but people in hell are like Golding's hero Pincher Martin, Christopher Martin, who at the point of death can experience the violence of God's love only as an annihilating force. Can't take it, clinging to themselves in the teeth of this holy terror. They can't accept that self-dispossession, letting themselves go, is the precondition of being alive, is the precondition of eternal life. We can't accept that either fully. We try, but at the point of death, you're expected to surrender not just this or that, your entire self. And love, which is also a sort of dispossession, is a kind of dry run for death. It's one of the many kinships between eros and thanatos, between love and death. One of the worst, which of course is being in love with death. That's to say, what Freud would call the death drive, but more of that in a moment. Too precious in their own eyes, people like Pincher Martin, to turn their act of dying into an act of self-giving. They're simply wiped out of existence. I think also of Graham Greene's thinking in Brighton Rock, who is simply, if you remember, kind of just kicked out of existence. Disappears, more or less, evaporates into empty space. So the good news is that the damned are not those who are going to be roasted forever and ever. I mean, the forever and ever suggests that eternity is perpetuity, a common state, of course, to mistake eternity, which is out of time or endless time. They're not those, that's a mistake finality for perpetuity. They're those for whom death will prove an absolute blind alley. You won't roast forever. That's good news, because bad news, there'll be nobody there to roast. Golding's novel, interestingly, I used to think that was a novel about hell, but actually it isn't, I think, for this reason. It ends before we know whether Martin will cling to his swollen ego with his huge lobster-like claws, in which he's trying to defend his self against the invasion of the black lightning of God's love. It ends before we know whether that love gets through to him or whether it just burns him to a cinder. He shouts, "I shit on your heaven." That's almost the last thing we hear again. Will he refuse to give up? But the so-called fire of hell, God, refuses to give up on Martin at the end, the very end of the novel. It's still flickering and playing around these monstrously swollen claws, with which Martin says, too precious, meaning himself, is too precious to die. To be in hell is not to be able to die, in that sense. But he's certainly at the novel, he's not yet in hell, because we don't know the outcome of this. We want to see whether this lightning will infiltrate his defences and dissolve him into a more fertile kind of nothingness, of non-being. There are different kinds of non-being. There's the non-being of evil, of which I'll say a bit more in a moment. There's also a fertile kind of non-being, which is the self-giving, which is the self-surrender. When Lear barks to Cordelia, blusters to Cordelia, nothing will come of nothing, he couldn't be more wrong. Our play shows how something really will only come of nothing, will only come of the recognition of the frailness and fragility of humanity. And Martin's not having any of that. He's not yet in hell, because at the end of the novel, he hasn't yet refused God's love, though he's trying, as I say, desperate to fend it off. If he does refuse it, it will burn him to nothing. And that's what we mean by hell. If he doesn't refuse it, then maybe there'll be a happier outcome. In other words, in a word, it took me 20 years to realize it's not a novel about hell, it's not about purgatory. It's about being on the very brink of the threshold at one's death of this kind of choice. And there's an astonishing surprise at the end of the novel, which I will now reveal, unless you all give £10 just step in. Sorry, I'm just trying to think this mixed up. There are people, some theologians called universalists. That's the funny. Like Boris Johnson. Would anybody just run back to my hotel? Sorry. Oh yes, there we are. I can't read my own imagination. There are people, theologians called universalists, who believe that nobody could be in hell for once. And that's because they can't imagine how anybody could be exposed, like Martin, to the love of God and turn it down. That, in some ways, perhaps one can see the force of that case, and it's not an unattractive case, either. Though, of course, it risks depriving us of freedom. Final freedom will be the utterly terrifying liberty of giving God himself the culture of turning him down. You know, when he's beseeching you not to, as Alexei Karamazov does, essentially in Dostoevsky's novel, turns him down, knows exactly what he's doing, but he won't accept God. Slightly different point than that, only by being in atrocious pain can the evil persuade themselves that they're still alive. They relish their agony, they cling to their agony because it's their only way of existing. They would rather cling to the obscene enjoyment of forcing others and themselves to suffer, which is a kind of nothingness, a kind of deprivation of being, rather than risk the much more frightening nothingness of abandoning themselves in the faith that something might finally come out of it, but with no guarantees necessarily. That's why Pincher Martin shits on heaven, because the love of God will rob him of his identity along with his torment. And his identity is so vested in his torment that he can't stand the idea of losing his torment, even though he hates it, even though he's suffering all the time. So the wicked cling to their anguish like a lover. The demonic is a kind of cosmic sulking, since comfort and forgiveness would be its undoing. It can't for a moment accept being forgiven and shies away from it as a kind of horror. There's a lot of this in Dostoevsky, I think. The satanic declares a character in Brothers Karamazov, I quote, demand that there be no God of life, that God destroy himself and all his creation, and they shall burn everlastingly in the flames of their own hatred and long for death and non-being, that death shall not be granted them. You want to destroy creation. As I was saying earlier on today at Heaven, the doctrine of creation has nothing much to do with the idea of God creating the world. That's a mistake. As Thomas Aquinas argues, God is not to be seen as a celestial manufacturer. And the New Testament, anti-Semitic term, New Testament, the Christian scriptures have almost nothing to say about God as created the world. I mean, of course, Christians believe he did, but that's not the point of the doctrine. Of course, the doctrine is something I've said earlier on that I won't repeat, unless you ask me about it. But of course, destruction is a form of creation as well. The devil is in a sort of permanent diabolical sulk because God has cornered all the good bits. You know, God has cornered the creation. And so the only thing, the devil is permanently belated. The only thing left open to the devil is to destroy, because of course, as any toddler who puts its foot through a toy knows, that's a form of creation. As anybody who's drunkenly smashed a shop window, so a friend tells me, that's also a form of creation. The damned are in the grip of what Freud calls the death drive, thanatos, and the true perversity of that drive is not just that we're hell-bent, as they say, on destroying ourselves, but that we do so because we take pleasure in the act of tearing ourselves apart. And that is such as Freud recognizes. Freud, with his great pity for the ego, that's such a tremendous force that how you would oppose that. For example, what kind of love could oppose that? What kind of force could transform that is a real question. It's when we turn that drive outwards and destroy others just for the sake of doing so, not for any practical end that we can talk about evil. It's a very, very rare thing. The word, of course, is bandied around too much. As the police inspector said, could tell just by looking at him that he was evil. No, you can't. Hindley and Brady and Hindley, Moore's murderers, strangle children for no reason. It's an astonishing fact. For no reason at all, other than kicks you get out of it. Now, there is a kind of paradox to evil, which I don't understand. This is one of the very, very few things in I don't understand. I'm worried about. I don't understand it. I'm crazy, irritated by it. But maybe you will see the answer to this, right? On the one hand, as Dostoevsky remarks, the evil, the damned are those who long for non-being. They are in love with non-being. And that's important because what they can't stomach is not just this or that thing. That's true of anybody. You can't, you don't like this, we can't tolerate that. They can't tolerate creation itself. That is a scandal, an open wound. That's the fact that there should be anything. As I said earlier on, if God isn't a being, it's not true either, as the most famous of French theologians argues, that God is being. His title of one of his books is God Beyond Being. You're talking astonishingly about a God that isn't even identified with being. But the damned are those who, where they differ from common or garden immorality, whatever you call it, is that they're not opposed to this or that value. They're opposed to value and meaning as such. And that, of course, is extremely rare and, logically speaking, kind of impossible, since you must presumably value your own rejection of value. Otherwise, you wouldn't. In fact, the damned regard the whole business of value and meaning as a kind of pompous sham, a kind of ludicrously pretentious charade. And like Iago confronting Othello, have an irresistible urge to show it up as bogus, to cut it down to size, to expose it into all this mouth-filling rhetoric that Othello produces. I mean, just irritates Iago beyond belief. So that's to say, I suppose, in a word, evil is a kind of cynicism. The doctrine I've just described is cynicism, which of course is different from skepticism. In its eyes, goodness is a kind of hollow posturing. It's a screen. What is real? What is real, and what only is real for the Iagos? Appetite and self-interest. Appetite and self-interest. Shakespeare, of course, knows all about this, can see all this, which people like Iago think is concealed behind pious and pretentious fictions. And that is why traditionally hell resounds, not that there's a place called hell, but resounds not only with the agonized cries of the damned, but also with jeering and cackling and mocking laughter, with the whoops of farce and the sniggers of low comedy. There's a wonderful passage on this in what perhaps is the greatest novel ever written about evil, title of which I will tell you if you just Thomas Mann's Dr. Faustus. The devil is a clown as well as a nihilist. He's a buffoon. Yes, he's a crude, crackling buffoon who has no respect for any person or any kind of value. And hell is a place of the mad, the surreal, the excremental, the monstrous, and disgusting nihilism. But it's also full of buffoonish yelps and guffaws at the sheer folly of humanity. I mean, the absurdity of our pompous, self-regarding assumption that there can be anything meaningful or valuable about our lives. Because evil is in love with non-being, Non-being, of course, is pure and uncontaminated. You can't get purer than nothingness. It's the French symbolists view in their own way. Because evil doesn't like that. It can't tolerate matter. The stock of creation, because matter is messy, imperfect, indeterminate, ambiguous stuff. The wicked, in that sense, are pathological purists. They are ascetic and virulently anti-materialist. Forget about, orgies and wine and sex and all that. That's not what they're interested in at all. That's just badness or, immorality, whatever you want to call it. I mean, the wicked are those who precisely don't enjoy an orgy. Hitler couldn't stand being touched, for instance. So, as with the Holocaust, their aim is to destroy this revolting stuff, this matter, and return it to a pure state of non-being. But that's a self-defeating project because, there's always more matter to be exterminated. There are always more Jews to be killed. You don't know when you're finished with this project. How can you exterminate non-being? They also are people who can't face the fact that there is a necessary lack to what we are. If they can't face deficiency, or despite being deficient beings themselves, if they're very puristic about it, then they can't face the fact that subjectivity itself is a kind of lack or negativity. Jacques Lacan speaks of la manque que nous sommes, the lack that we are, And so they try to stuff this gaping wound, which is self-inflicting, with all kinds of fetishes. Fetishes are things that you use to plug some fearful gap, which is intolerable to, doctrines, people, possessions, strategies, sponge rubber trousers, and so on. So the evil are those who can't bear the fact that they're incomplete, which is to say they can't bear the fact they're human. However, and this is the bit that I can't understand, reluctant I am to admit, there seems to be a paradox in evil, namely that if it chooses, on the one hand, non-being over being, it also does the opposite. It's in love with non-being, but it also seems to detest it. There's a kind of solution to this, which is that, normally speaking, the evil don't like being, but there are moments, there are, as it were, Dionysian and orgiastic moments within evil where they simply revel in it, where you let down the guard and you simply revel in it. The farcical side of Nazism, which is not simply about conscience, but it's about reveling in meaninglessness, relishing the absurd, really fearful kinds of things. But why did the Nazis detest Jews and gay people, women, foreigners, disabled, and so on? Well, partly because they seemed, these frightful figures seemed to them to embody a kind of non-being, a deficiency of being, and therefore posed a threat to their own lust for purity and perfection. But laying violent hands on those who embody negativity won't bring you any closer to murdering, getting rid of the non-being at the heart of yourself, the lack, la manque qui nous sommes, the lack that makes us ourselves in the first place. So what I can't understand then is why evil seems both attracted to non-being and repelled by it in different moments. I will be asking this question. I'll be going around one by one asking this question to the resolution of this question at the end of the show. You better have an answer ready. Now, on the theory that I'm presenting, evil doesn't mean very, very bad. It's not an intensifier as it's commonly used. Not as bad, evil. Not only are the evil in a sense not immoral, they see themselves as some sense beyond morality altogether. You mustn't forget about the elitist dimension of the diabolical. I mean, morality is for the middle classes, people like us, morally mediocre, morally mixed kind of people that we are. Not for the diabolical, puristic, absolutist elite. The damned constitute a privileged minority, unlike the moral classes, and therefore they are on terms, curiously, this is the sort of grey and green syndrome, I suppose, they are on terms with the very saints they abhor. As I've said, destruction can be the flip side of creation, it's on terms with it. They, saints and sinners understand each other, occupy the same terrain, move on a metaphysical plane far beyond the dreary suburban realm of, shoplifting and suburban adultery and things that don't really interest them at all. That's just kind of badness, as defined by somebody's law. So evil is not being very, very bad. It means a particular kind of badness, which is very rare, I think, and in which you delight in destruction just for the hell of it. Or which is a kind of technical term for it, just for the hell of it. So and like all things that appear motiveless, it's mysterious. It's a motiveless kind of malignity, which therefore seems like an enigma. It doesn't have really, in the end, it doesn't have any truck with common sense or bourgeois utility or rationality, instrumental rationality. I was talking about the creation earlier today as itself being a refutation of instrumental rationality, because God exists just, funny term, for the hell of it, yes, and so does the universe. It has no telos, no purpose beyond itself. It is a refutation of bourgeois instrumental rationality. The creation is a political doctrine, among other things. True evil, as they say, is autotelic, meaning having its end in itself. It has its grounds and origins and ends and purposes entirely in itself, and therefore occupies this part of a very small class of phenomena, which include God, as I just said, and art, and art as it has been defined since about 1780 or something. And would you believe it? Virtue, for goodness. Virtue, like art, is its own reward. Martyrs don't go to the stake for money. In fact, virtue had better be its own reward, because it's not likely to get any other. Henry Fielding says in Tom Jones that there is a good and noble doctrine that the virtuous will reap their reward in this world. Doctrine which has merely one defect, namely, it is not good. Of course, it isn't true. In the real world, Tom Jones would end up probably hanged, would end up with a homely wife and a big estate. Is it now the case that virtue is only possible in fiction? Is the novel standing in for something? Is it only there that we can distribute rewards and penalties, rights and wrongs, in the way that we wish we could do in the world? Has the novel in itself a utopian dimension, therefore, to it? So good and evil are on unnervingly intimate terms. Eliot thought this, T.S. not George, thought this. There's a whole rather dangerous strain of kind of right-wing Christian thought that better to be evil than to be nothing. Better to be active. But we should, whatever one thinks about that, we should remember that the devil was once an angel. Scriptures see that. The devil was once an angel. And since both good and evil are in this sense autotelic, they both have a resemblance to the aesthetic. That's just creation itself, as I just said. Let me illustrate what I mean by a concrete example, what I mean about the autotelism of evil. Stalin and Mao were much worse than Hitler in the sense that they murdered together, and indeed, I think, separately, they murdered far more people, of course, than Hitler did. When it comes to murder, statistics are, of course, important. It's common nowadays to dismiss, to be rather casual, cavalier about statistics. How many times do they say on television, and don't forget, behind every statistic, there's a genuine, real, flesh and blood human being. Latest cliches. Everybody is different. Everybody is individual. Statistics clump us together. Everybody is different. There could be no medicine. There could be no thousands of things couldn't exist if it was literally the case that everybody is different. Of course they aren't. So, the number of people you kill matters a lot. But Stalin and Mao killed for a political purpose, however wicked and however twisted. I don't mean that makes them any better, it just makes them different. Well, why did the Nazis murder so many Jews? There was some reason for it, to be sure, to purify the race. But to do that, you don't need to create or to unify the nation, let's say. But to unify the nation, you don't need to murder 6 million people. You don't need to create a bogeyman of that size. That's crazily excessive to your practical political aim. It is the crazed excessiveness of the Holocaust, the obscene gratuitousness of it. There's also a good kind of gratuitousness I was talking about earlier today, which is the creation, the astonishing fact there's something rather than nothing, whereas there's no need for that at all. There might just as easily have been nothing rather than something. And the Christian answer to the question, why is there anything rather than nothing, is God. But it's the cynical sadism of the Holocaust in that respect that's most striking. And also, of course, it's counterproductive. Quite not only was there no need to do that, it was actually counterproductive. It tied us up. As we know, it tied up troops and material that could have been used in the war effort. It killed people whose skills and talents could have been deployed in the war effort and so on. It's much harder to say why Hitler killed Jews than to say why Stalin killed Gulags. Which isn't, of course, needless to say, to justify Stalin, just to say we're talking about two different kinds of things here. In fact, the Nazis despised any kind of utilitarian rationality, the kind that Stalin is particularly part of. So there's a sense in which I think where I'm coming to an end very shortly. The sense that the struggle between virtue and evil is one between being and nothingness. I suppose that's part of what I'm saying. And that the ultimate nothingness is known as hell. Yet you might equally claim that it's a struggle between two kinds of nothingness, a good kind of non-being and the bad kind mostly talking about. On the one hand, the dead end, the Eagleton of hell, and on the other hand, the more precious and fertile kind of nothingness, which is to acknowledge the utter ungrounded gratuitousness of one's being, its fragility and its finitude. To do that, as with Leo, may mean being hauled through hell, with no guarantees that you'll emerge somewhere at the other end. And the name for that process is tragedy. In other words, that things are so dire with us, Shakespeare recognizes that only by that breaking and remaking could we have any chance of overcoming the situation. Only by a self-dispossession so radical that it goes all the way through and comes out somewhere on the other side, could we hope to oppose the really frightful forces that I've been talking about. So there are those who fear nothingness as a threat to their own fullness of being, who find it embodied in those destitute or semi-destitute creatures who lurk on the threshold of the city-state, as Oedipus does in King Theseus's Athens, and who are then like Sophocles is Theseus confronted with choice. Either they can shrink from this monstrous presence which will contaminate the city-state irreparably, regard it as alien and seek to annihilate it, or like Theseus, they can acknowledge this thing of darkness as their own. In acknowledging this full head which is the alien, they're also acknowledging something profoundly alien about themselves that they have to live with, and welcome it, as Theseus does finally, into the city. If they do that, albeit in fear and trembling, then, as with Oedipus at Colonus, a great powerful good is likely to follow. Thank you.